Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, Retail Media Measurement, Closing the Loop Across Media Formats and Sales Channels. I'm your host, Evelyn Mitchell-Wolfe, Senior Analyst at Insider Intelligence based out of Virginia, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Vice President and Principal Analyst, Andrew Lipsman, who's in Chicago. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Evelyn. Great to be with you today.
We're so glad to have you here. Before we get into the main presentation, I'd like to thank Adobe for making today's webinar possible and welcome Shailesh Khadapkar, Principal Strategist at Adobe. He's joining us from Princeton. Hi, Shailesh.
Hi, Evelyn. Thanks for having me today.
Of course. We're so happy to have you. A few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes if you'd rather not. We'll email you a link to view the slides and the full recording of today's presentation. But we do want you to participate. So just use the chat window on the right of the video feed to submit questions at any time during the presentation. And then we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A at the end of the session. So with that, Andrew, let's get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Evelyn. I'm really excited to be talking about this topic today. Anyone who knows me knows that my two favorite topics are retail media and measurement. So the intersection of the two is something I'm really excited to share with you today. So we're going to be talking about how we close the loop across media formats and sales channels. So one of the things that's happening in retail media today is we're at a transition point from the retail media 1.0 era into the retail media 2.0 era. And these overlap, so it's a fluid transition. But the 1.0 era is search, and this is largely what's built retail media up to a $45 billion industry today. And it's evolving into the 2.0 era, which is marked by ads moving up the funnel and into the store. Now, if you think about the drivers of retail media's growth, it begins with contextual relevance down at the bottom left. Ads are appearing in front of consumers right before they're about to purchase in the context of an e-commerce visit. This, of course, then leads to closed loop measurement where you can see conversions based on ad exposures. Then this evolution was catching steam and accelerated through the rise of e-commerce during the pandemic in 2020, 2021. Now, as we transition into the 2.0 era, we're hearing about value drivers like the importance of first-party data, filling the needs driven by third-party data deprecation and the end of cookies, and moving towards a full funnel advertising solution. Now, I get asked very often, why is retail media a thing? Why has it gotten so hot in the last year? Well, many of us have been following it for much longer than that, but the common thinking is that it's really driven by cookie deprecation. And it's certainly an accelerant to this trend, but to me, the foundation is really closed loop measurement. That is fundamentally what retail media is all about. So I want everyone to think about that and remember that as we move along through this presentation. Putting these eras in a bit more context, I'm going to talk you through how retail media is going to evolve from the 1.0 era to 2.0 and eventually 3.0. I'm not going to talk much about the 3.0 era, but it's worth having that context. So across these two dimensions, retail media is evolving across media and advertising format, and then across channels. So if we work our way up, we're going from the search era into up the funnel ads in display and video, streaming TV, and in-store ads. Eventually, we're going to have the last best marketing touch point, which is product samples. The evolution across attribution or sales channels begins with online, and now we're moving into in-store or physical world attribution. And over time, we're actually going to start to be able to account for the advertising value that's generated over the lifetime value of purchases. So think of that attribution as ROAS. Right now, we're in the 1.0 era of ROAS, which is a much smaller number than if you start to account for all of these other sales that happen across channels and over time. With that, I'm going to take you quickly through the agenda of what we'll talk about today. There are four primary sections here. The first one is retail media standardization. The next one is what's going to happen when closed loop measurement enters into streaming TV. I think a really exciting opportunity on the horizon here. We're going to talk about attribution and everybody's favorite word right now, incrementality. And lastly, in-store retail media measurement, which is starting to emerge. Then we'll wrap it up with some key takeaways. So let's talk about standardization. If you talked to me a year or maybe 18 months ago and said, standardization is such a problem in retail media, I would have said, what are you talking about? You did not hear this as something that brands were talking about, and it just ratcheted up very quickly as brands are trying to spread their budgets across so many channels. And so the ANA did a study at the beginning of this year where they asked what the biggest challenges for ad buyers were with retail media networks, and lack of standardization was number one by a pretty healthy margin. You hear about different attribution windows, right? They'll produce a ROAS number, return on ad spend, but you don't know if it's 7 days or 14 days or 28 or 30 days. And then there's verification metrics. So there's all sorts of inconsistencies that can happen there. There's problems that are based on the fact that you're seeing metrics just within the walled garden environment of these RMNs. There's not a way to understand if advertising that's delivered through that RMN drives sales outside of that retailer. So you need multi-retailer sales lift solutions as an example to help address that challenge. Timeliness of data. When we're talking about offline and in-store attribution, a lot of times that data does not come back very quickly. So that's also a problem that you can't action on the data quickly enough. Lack of standardization drives a ton of inefficiencies across all phases of retail media: buying, planning, activation, and measurement. The most common source of inefficiency, according to this Epsilon survey, was inconsistent targeting. So if I'm a brand, I want to have the same audience segments, be able to build those audience segments and scale it across channels. And I can't necessarily do that. I might have to use proxies or similar types of audiences. I want consistency. I get back disparate reporting. I have to plan and execute across all these different networks. My metrics are fragmented, right? There's all these headaches because it's not standardized. Fortunately, we're starting to see the beginnings of solutions to this in the form of data clean rooms, which brings all of those disparate pieces together and can really aid in retail media standardization. Now, this research from the IAB asked about the top data clean room use cases. And what's interesting is at the top of the responses, you see things like data anonymization, privacy and compliance, normalizing the data, right? All these are data hygiene factors, and absolutely that is the foundation of data clean rooms. But you also see here in red attribution and ROAS measurement and market mix modeling. So measurement and optimization use cases are starting to become much more prominent. And I think the future of data clean rooms is going to move much more in the direction of those factors.
Yeah, Andrew, if I can jump in here, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about and writing about data clean rooms myself. And I totally agree with you that measurement use cases will become some of the most important that data clean rooms facilitate. But I do want to mention that while data clean rooms are indeed becoming one of the most sought after privacy-preserving technologies for data collaboration, measurement included, they're not a silver bullet, and they're actually going through their own kind of standardization process as the industry solves for interoperability. Because when a data clean room can only power measurement on a single platform, that severely limits the utility, and advertisers are still unable to gain a full picture of their investment across all their retail media platforms. So the IAB has developed a new interoperability specification for data clean rooms, so that's good progress, but it'll take a while to scale adoption. So definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it's a brilliant tool, but sometimes its strength is its weakness. It can do so many things, right? That part of making it useful is how do you make it more operable and easier to use for everybody, because it can do so many different things. But tons of potential there, and we're starting to realize that potential. So let's talk about closed loop streaming TV measurement. As retail media is now moving up the funnel into these other formats, what we're seeing is a variety of partnerships where retailers are basically plugging their first-party data into major media environments. Off to the right, we've seen a bunch of publisher partnerships. So Amazon and Pinterest, Walgreens and Dollar General working with Meta, Walmart and TikTok, things of that nature. But on the streaming TV side of things, you've got Kroger and Disney was a recent announcement. Kroger and Roku is probably the most long-standing relationship here. Roku actually has partnered with many retailers, as you can see, and then Walmart and NBC Universal was a recent one. Sitting at the center of this also, Amazon, Thursday Night Football, Amazon as the retailer, but it is acquiring its own content and basically performing the same function. So there's a lot happening here as we're starting to connect the pipes. We have not fully realized the opportunity just yet. So this market of retail media in streaming TV is less than $1 billion today, according to our new and latest forecast, 813 million, but it's growing really quickly. And as we cast it forward a few years, we can see that very aggressive growth rates are expected to continue. And by 2027, it will be almost a $6 billion market. You can almost imagine where it's going to go from there, right? This is the future, I think, of TV advertising. And now we're starting to pick up steam. So one of the things that's so compelling about streaming TV and retail media intersecting is how it can be used. So it's both for branding and performance. TV ads have traditionally been purely about branding. It is historically the least measurable medium. But here's how retailers are using CTV today. Their top goals are upper funnel in some cases, like acquiring new customers or brand awareness, but also lower funnel objectives, driving traffic to e-commerce sites, to physical stores, to drive coupon redemptions, all of these sorts of things that are really all about conversion. So this is the future of TV and where it's going. Now, how the loop closes across different formats is very different. I love this research from Perpetua, where it looks at different formats of Amazon advertising and then looks at how long it takes for those ad impressions essentially to convert. I'm going to work from the bottom up here because it's the bottom of the funnel, those sponsored product or search ads. And you can see the vast majority of those convert pretty quickly. That blue bar is less than 2 hours time. I imagine most of them probably convert within a couple of minutes, but the vast majority, understandably in search, convert quickly. The demand side platform ads, that's largely display in video on the open web, it's about 50-50 in terms of those ads converting within 24 hours or outside of 24 hours. Lastly, streaming TV or OTT advertising, the vast majority of those ads convert over a much longer time horizon, about 80% of them outside of 1 day's time. And in fact, over 40% take longer than 7 days to convert. So very, very different conversion dynamics across these different channels. Now we're going to talk about attribution and incrementality. Before I get into talking about incrementality as it pertains to sales lift and conversions, I do want to first talk about a different form of incrementality, which is incremental reach. This is often how you get to a point of driving incremental sales, right? You have to reach new customers or those coveted new to brand customers, as it's often talked about in retail media world. This data coming from Epsilon looks at a number of retail media networks of different types and campaigns that ran both on-site and off-site. And what you can see here is while those ads that are appearing on-site, are very high quality ads and may be very likely to convert, that ends up being a very small percentage of the total audience reach. It's the off-site reach and that audience extension that you can get that helps you get those incremental audiences. And in these cases where 80-90% of the total audience reach was off-site. You can imagine you can also close the loop on sales with those additional audiences. So let's talk about attribution as it pertains to offline purchases. We did some research that we published last year on retail media networks where we asked a bunch of brands what attributes of retail media networks were extremely important. And across 13 different attributes, the top 2 were traffic quality and traffic scale. All right, most of those dollars are going into search, so you can imagine that they want to reach a lot of people and the right audiences who are going to convert. Fair enough. But number 3, and this was quite a surprise at the time, was in-store and omni-channel sales data. So these brands are saying, we want to know not just how these ads perform on-site, but also with the other 85% of retail sales that are happening in store, right? It's a huge opportunity. Perhaps the effects are more subtle in driving offline purchase, but you're affecting a much larger pool of spend, and you can't ignore those impacts. ROAS, when you account for offline sales, can significantly increase. So this research from the Path to Purchase Institute and Criteo asked retail media ad buyers basically what the most important campaign performance metrics were. And what I thought was interesting is across a variety of different metrics, which you can read for yourself, the top 4 were all really attribution-based metrics. But within that, the most commonly used metric is return on ad spend. And it's certainly high up on the list. But number 1 was actually incremental sales. That's an interesting insight because ROAS is so commonly used, but it's a metric also that doesn't give you the full picture, right? You can narrow cast the targeting of a campaign to a small audience, and you can have a very high ROAS, but it might not really move the needle on sales impact that much. So the incremental sales is really the most we're seeing that from brands and what they value.
Yeah, Andrew, if I can hop in here, just to provide my perspective, I also study search advertising, and this is an age-old issue with lower funnel media, right? And it's something that comes up really frequently in my research on search advertising. So it really makes sense that it's also a conversation in retail media. And actually, I think the proximity to purchase in retail media can become a double-edged sword here when it comes to measuring performance of on-platform ads, because it's even easier for a purchase that was already going to happen to be kind of routed through a sponsored listing. So solving for that element of that incremental element of the retail media measurement equation becomes even more important to making informed investment decisions.
Right, and it may not necessarily correlate at all. In one instance, you can pay for only branded terms for your search. Somebody searches for your brand, they're probably going to convert on your brand. So your return on ad spend can be really high, may not be really incremental sales at all. So brands also are, I think, going to start demanding incrementality measurement. Actually, I will say they are all clamoring for it, and it is the top thing that I hear from brands today, particularly CPG brands. And in this research from Sky and BWG Strategy, the leading challenges that can slow investment in retail media is, in addition to proving performance and ROI, proving incrementality. So I think that is going to be increasingly demanded, even though it's not always provided by retailers today. ROAS is a blunt instrument, right? It is useful in many ways. I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. It is useful to cross-compare, and it performs a vital function, but it doesn't give you the whole picture. Incremental ROAS, or iROAS, I think paints a much more realistic picture of campaign effectiveness. In this research from Incremental, who specializes in just this sort of stuff, they looked at the same campaigns and based on how they performed in terms of return on ad spend and incremental return on ad spend. Off to the left, you can see the ROAS picture. You have about only 9% of campaigns basically don't even perform on a one-to-one basis. And the majority, 64%, are giving you these really outsized 6-to-1 returns or higher. To the right, you get a much more realistic picture. About a third of campaigns essentially don't perform. Listen, that happens. Like, there are a lot of variables that affect campaign effectiveness, including creative, media planning, et cetera. But this is reality. Some of them aren't going to perform great, but most of them do. And some of them perform incredibly well. But I think this is the sort of picture that we need to move to really understand how campaigns are performing. They also ranked campaigns according to how they performed on iROAS versus ROAS. And if you're looking at this scatter plot and saying, I don't see the pattern here, that's exactly the point. There is no pattern. There is no correlation between ROAS and iROAS of campaigns. You can have campaigns that are actually designed specifically to drive high ROAS, but for reasons we just mentioned, it might not prove incrementality at all. So important learning here to be considered of. Lastly, we're going to talk about in-store retail media measurement, a favorite emerging topic. It's been getting quite a bit of press this past week with Walmart making some announcements in this space. So, the first thing to think about is that audiences, and I apologize there for my dog. She must have heard something. In-store audiences are really, really large. There's considerable scale. And in this analysis, we looked at 13 different brick and mortar retailers. We looked at their digital audiences, which is what again got them to $45 billion in retail media ad spend to date. And we compared it to the in-store audiences, unduplicated reach. And what you see is across the board, those in-store audiences are much larger, in some cases massive. Walmart, almost 200 million a month. Target, over 100 million a month. On average here, they were 84% greater than the digital audiences. Now, there is no Nielsen TV ratings for these audiences today. I think the industry is going to have to move in that direction. So that is a measurement challenge that will need to be solved over time. In-store ads also drive branding effectiveness. There's an instinct to think of it only in terms of driving sales effectiveness, and it will, no doubt, and I have some data to prove that in just a moment, but branding also matters, right? It's the right context in order for you to put your brand in front of somebody and make them consider it and think about it and drive that brand equity over time. In this campaign on cooler screen doors of a national ice cream brand, there was an increase across every phase of branding effectiveness, brand consideration, brand opinion or favorability, and ultimately purchase intent. And it kind of makes sense that you're going to see a bigger effect on purchase intent than upper funnel, but it certainly is affecting all phases of the funnel. Now, sales effectiveness, this data coming from Perch, which has interactive displays either at aisle or at end caps. And they've done studies across a number of categories, and you can see that the in-store sales lift of their displays are pretty significant, anywhere from about 30% to 180% or so. And a lot of these effects accumulate over time. One other fact that I want to layer in here when thinking about measuring in-store performance is creative optimization. It's very easy to look past creative. I think oftentimes this happens because it's a little bit more difficult to measure or quantify, but you can, and the impact is real. So this data comes from a bunch of A/B tests from CellCheck, where they essentially looked at shelf violators. For those who don't know, it's kind of like those placards that you see in the aisle of the grocery store that just are designed to grab your attention for a brand, maybe offer a promotion. And what you see across the board, as you would expect, any shelf violator is going to grab some attention. So the test or the control is showing a lift across every one of these tests. But there's also an ability to optimize that creative. And when the creative is optimized, you can get on average much higher lifts. So it didn't happen in every case, right? There's always some unique dynamics with creative that may be difficult to measure. So in this case, number 8 actually saw higher on the non-optimized campaign. I'm sure there were some unique aspects to that one because it performed so well on the non-optimized. But that said, creative can be optimized and it can produce much higher lifts and increase attribution. Last thing I wanted to talk about before I wrap up with some final comments is store analytics. I think this is the beginning of a really transformative trend. If you think about e-commerce today, right, we have been optimizing the funnel when somebody gets onto the homepage of an e-commerce site, into the landing page, and working their way all the way through the checkout process. We haven't had that in store yet. Increasingly, there are ways to measure these types of behaviors within the confines of a store in privacy compliant ways. And so in this research from Futurum, what you see is the reported use of different store technologies amongst retailers that they classified as the most resilient, sort of forward-looking and able to anticipate future trends. The number one use was retail media. So, and you can see the differentiation between those resilient and non-resilient retailers. But fourth is shopper and operational analytics. So this to me, it really speaks to that store analytics trend that I think, and there's a big difference there too of 11 percentage points between those two groups. I think the ones who really get ahead of the curve are going to understand what's happening within their store and be able to start optimizing store configurations and the path to purchase when people are exposed to retail media, and then ultimately, do they go to the correct aisle and pick up that product off the shelf? Okay, so lastly, let's wrap it up with some key takeaways. When I think about what's next for retail media measurement, standardization, right, it's starting to happen. We've got some leading voices. We've got industry bodies that are all playing a role. So the conversation is starting to move forward. I think clean rooms are going to play a really critical role to help standardize data. And to the extent that we also have industry bodies who are setting standards that everyone can start to adhere to, that's going to make it that much easier. But ultimately, it leads us to where we have more unified retail media measurement that I think will make the retail media 2.0 era much easier. There's so much opportunity in this era, but it's much more complex than the first era. So this is a way to sort of simplify the complex and really drive a lot of value. Next, I think that closing the loop on TV, ad targeting and attribution is going to completely revolutionize TV as we think of it today. and how brands start to allocate spend to the least measurable medium. When they know that if you're a CPG brand, that those ads deliver performance in the store, and maybe not just within a specific store, but stores nationwide, I think that's going to start to attract a lot more brand investment. Offline sales, again, we have not well accounted for retail media's incremental impact on the other 85% of retail sales that are happening in stores. That's going to boost that ROAS number that we're looking at today. That $3 ROAS or $4 ROAS might go to $5 or $6, maybe higher. You're going to see that start to bring a lot more dollars online. And then lastly, in-store retail media, we're getting the foundations of measurement, and that measurement is what helps ad markets grow. It's a very small market with very high potential. It needs that measurement scaffolding. It has to be scalable and standardized around third-party audience, brand lift, and sales lift metrics, including multi-retailer data. We're going to get there, and it's going to help this opportunity really take off over time. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you, Evelyn.
Thanks, Andrew. That was excellent. And before we get to your questions live, dear audience, and we've had some good ones come in so far, so please keep them coming. I'd love to bring back our special guest, Shailesh Khadapkar, Principal Strategist at Adobe. So welcome again, Shailesh.
Hi, Evelyn. Thanks for having me.
We're so happy you're here. And we have some interesting questions to ask you. So at Adobe, you have a really interesting, market position. I'm sure you talk to a lot of retailers about this measurement challenge. So what are you seeing as kind of the big major challenges for retailers as they pull their measurement together for their retail media network?
Yeah. Firstly, let me start by sharing the same sentiment that Andrew shared, which is RMNs and measurement are near and dear to my heart. Extremely passionate about the topic, so very excited to be here, to be able to speak about it. But it's an interesting question you asked, right? Because as retailers are embracing their ability to elevate measurement capabilities at RMNs, it's a bit of deja vu for retailers because the measurement challenge has always existed. It predates back from the RMN days, right from when marketing measurement was a thing, paid media measurement was a thing. And in our assessments, we've observed three major challenges, right? It's a silo data foundation, and I'll explain what they are. Silo data foundation, the ability to streamline consistent metrics across different ad formats and channels that they add, and the ability to democratize access and quickly share and leverage insights to be able to act on it in real time, right? What we've observed is a lot of retailers, although invest in a data foundation for audience building and activation, the ability to stitch those interactions, attribute it to offline sales, is usually an afterthought, right? Like there is an over reliance on platforms like ad servers or other point solutions that might get you across the hump. And it's usually thought after a lot of these campaigns have launched. So that's one of the major challenges that we're noticing. It's like they don't think about it up front. They don't think about establishing the KPI frameworks, the metrics that matter. And then they're trying to scramble towards the end to be able to complete the measurement. As Andrew rightly pointed, right, retail media network started as a thing with sponsored products. Today, it's extended into offsite. It's gotten into paid social, into display, into connected TV, into online video. As we add on additional channels, as we add on additional ad formats, establishing consistency across metrics is challenging, right? Some platforms might have the undue advantage of being able to establish attribution for both online and in-store. Some others might be siloed by just online. Others might just be limited to interaction-related metrics, right? The metrics vary, and guess what? The entire ability to streamline it across different RMNs also is a major challenge, right? There's one extremely important and unique challenge that all RMNs face here is the ability to tack on margin that they are passing on top of the pass-through cost, right? That I think is the single most important reason why RMNs are unable to share transparent reporting, right? So the ability to offer a self-service portal, democratizing access, providing clear transparency across all metrics and insights are some of the challenges we are noticing in the market.
Well, what's your approach to streamlining or solving for those obstacles that you just talked through?
Yeah. And that's a good one because see, Adobe has always been a leader um, in the space to be able to deliver personalized experiences and tying it down to how those customer experiences impact performance, whether it's driving efficiencies or growing the business. So internally, Adobe is leveraging a lot of that expertise and learnings and findings to be able to help brands streamline their measurement capabilities, right? Like I think what we've done very well in the past few years is we've built what we call Adobe Experience Platform from the ground up. It's all based on a single ID, and it's probably the single most important investment the company has made in their ability to help retailers streamline their marketing capabilities, right? And what we're doing on top of that is we're building apps like RTCDP. And very importantly, we are significantly upgrading our measurement capabilities. I think when you think of Adobe, you might think of Adobe as Adobe Analytics. That's not true anymore, right? Like we have customer journey analytics and we have Adobe mixed model. Both of those bring to bear the promise of unified measurement, bring to bear the promise of incrementality, bring to bear the promise of being able to offer both top down and bottoms up measurement, right? And last but not the least, we are rapidly innovating on our Gen AI capabilities. So now through natural language queries, you can ask ad hoc questions. You can also rely on answers that you might need based on the course that you're creating. So it's an exciting time for Adobe, where we are trying to streamline a lot of these capabilities for retailers who want to use the tech stack across both their personalization and RMN capabilities.
Well, I think you might have, if anyone's playing ad tech bingo out there, I think the mention of generative AI probably gave someone bingo. So congratulations if you got bingo. I'd love to talk a little bit more in depth about closed loop measurement for those offsite channels you mentioned, as retail media kind of expands across the digital ecosystem, channels like CTV, display, online video, all of that kind of has to come together in the measurement equation. So how do you look at the closed loop measurement equation?
Yeah.
Everything is accounted for.
I mean, admittedly, it's a new muscle that we are trying to build through a different lens, right? Like, and don't get me wrong, Adobe Analytics as a data source was always critical and pivotal for you to be able to complete any type of measurement to begin with, because we had such rich amounts of or vast amounts of like site analytics data that you would use to be able to measure the impact of paid media, whether it's connected TV or display or video. But beyond that, what we have going for us is the ability to now tie in-store sales to paid media interactions through our tools in AEP. Right? Not just that, we've recently announced a LiveRAM integration that will help you ingest anonymous data to be able to now bring all of that data in AEP and now stitch a lot of the anonymous click-throughs and impressions wherever possible to in-store activity and sales. As I mentioned earlier, as part of AMM, we can now bring unified measurement to bear, which is we can now help you build media mix models, which means you can measure the impact of branding metrics on paid media. And you can help measure the attribution of in-store sales and online activity to digital interactions that otherwise you're able to stitch at the individual ID level. So a lot of that is what we are trying to bring to the table. And last but not the least, we've recognized everyone's asking for incrementality, right? Like it's an RMN, I believe at this point in time, will not be successful if they are not able to measure incrementality. With AMM, we can make that streamlined. We can help you with incrementality testing and measure the incremental ROAS that otherwise you would need in order to prove how you can attract incremental investment in your media networks.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shailesh. And it's time to get into our audience Q&A. And we've received a lot of great questions. So let's just dive right in here, shall we? So our first question here is about offline sales attribution, and what's holding it back. So what is holding back offline sales attribution from being a standard KPI in RMN reporting here?
Yeah. Through our assessments, right, like what we've observed is primarily there are silos in the organization, which means there is another party who owns in-store data, and there is another team that is relying on digital interactions and online data. So that's one major barrier, is the ability for two teams to talk, exchange data, and being able to actually bring it into measurement at a standard KPI. Now, brands who successfully straddle the org challenge face a different challenge, which is, okay, now that I have the data, how am I able to attribute that? Am I going to share my offline data with Facebook, with Google, with TikTok, with Pinterest, with Roku, or am I going to just bring all of that into my platform and perform the measurement all by myself, right? So different challenges that we've seen in the market, which is the ability to share data, the ability to overcome org and op model challenges, the ability to MarTech and AdTech to facilitate some of these. But I don't know, Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, all of that is absolutely true. It's often a data architecture problem, right? The two systems of data have been built separately and for different purposes. And a lot of retailers have just had to spend time bringing those things together. I think the ones who have had the easiest time being able to provide offline attribution are the ones with really high data fidelity in their membership and loyalty card programs, because there's already a level of integration with the data. And I've heard many retailers talk about the painful process of bringing these data sets together. So the KPIs may not be there in every retail media network yet, but I think it's a lot more imminent than certainly it was a year or two ago.
We love progress. So kind of a follow-up here, what is the best way to account for attribution credit differences between third-party measurement partners and then retail media networks themselves?
I'd start that question with answering by transparency. So a lot of times, ROAS differs from one platform to another. They have different attributions, and maybe with very good reason, right? It depends on the category that you're serving. Ads may take longer to perform in a higher consideration category. So it's not like there's not a logic to it, but all else equal, it's in the retailer's best interest to have the longest attribution window possible, so that they can maximize credit. It may not be the best metric that the brand wants. So I'd say, as a starting point, provide transparency, provide multiple attribution windows, show what that ROAS looks like across different attribution windows, and then also provide that incremental ROAS number. To me, it's just about giving that full visibility, and aligning around the basic standards that more or less everyone is using. I think that would solve a good portion of the problem, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, along those same lines, right? It's an interesting point you bring up, because in many instances, retail media networks or retailers are not open to sharing data with third-party partners for them to be able to complete the measurement, right? Like they act somewhat of like a wall garden. So you're kind of relying on retailers to be able to provide the measurement. So Andrew is exactly right. The ability to be transparent, the ability to reveal the entire flow of metrics, which is like, what is the spend? What is the impressions? What are the costs first? What is the ROAS? What is the incremental sales for different attribution windows? And what were those targeting tactics that were used will go a long way in their ability to ensure that measurement is satisfactory with brands who are choosing to invest in RMNs.
Absolutely. So we've brought the conversation back to incrementality here. Why are retail media networks held to such a high standard for ROAS and that incremental kind of piece of the equation, incremental ROAS, when other channels, not to name names, but Google and Facebook, aren't necessarily held to that same standard?
Yeah, Andrew, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think closed loop has always been a critical part of retail media measurement. I think, I mean, one of the big reasons probably has to do with the category that is centering the debate right now, and that is grocery and CPG. It's a category that is very low margin. As they moved it with full force into retail media in 2020 and 2021 because they had to, they understand that if they put $1 in, they are not actually getting $4 out. It's just not how the world of CPG works. You can't expect a 4x return. So incrementality, the actual number comes down a lot, but it resembles reality in this industry that is much lower margin. In a perfect world, I think every single ad platform would do it, but there's costs. It's harder to measure these sorts of things. There's different methodologies. So ROAS is the blunt instrument, the easier metric to provide.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that question you asked is gold, right? Because I think anyone who's interacted with me in the past, I've always made the effort to help them realize that, yes, you are being held to a high bar. It's not a question that you're ever going to post to Google and Facebook, but I think at the heart of it is CPG brands for the longest time aspired to get control of retailer data, right? Like if you think about it, CPGs don't necessarily have the luxury to understand or realize what that or where that endpoint conversion is taking place. Once retailers came in with the promise of being able to build audiences off of their transaction data that you could monetize, it opened new avenues for CPG brands, right? So what they want to know now is, okay, so if you have transaction data, we are willing to pay for that as part of the media pass-through cost, but we want to understand whether this is driving incremental value or not. It's not something, when you think about it, Google and Facebook do not have transaction data. Right? They rely on other parties to acquire the transaction data. A retailer has their own transaction data. CPG brands don't. So they're willing to pay additional dollars to get there. And that is exactly why they get held to a high bar, is because they can, right? They can. And at the end of it, it's about fighting for dollars. If they want to attract top dollar as part of an RMN, like instead of paying $5 directly to Facebook, I'd rather pay 7 to another retail media network in exchange for the data. Then why not? So I think that's the fundamental difference. How Andrew started this meeting, this webinar, was exactly what it is. It's closed loop measurement. It's closed loop measurement is actually driving retail media networks, and hence they're being held to an extremely high bar to be able to measure incrementality and incremental ROAS that is otherwise going to help them realize how effective their media investments are.
Awesome. Yeah, it's always all about data, isn't it? I mean, it's about reach as well, but the data really helps. All right. I have a question about tech stacks, and maybe Shailesh, you can weigh in here. What does a retailer need in their stack, and how does it all fit together to power the retail media measurement kind of process?
Is that a trick question? Like, am I supposed to say Adobe? No, it's a good question, right? A tech stack it's an interesting, emotional, passionate question, because when you think of a tech stack, it's not as simple as saying you're going to need these 10 or you're going to need these 15 platforms, right? When you are assessing anyone's tech stack, there are a myriad of different platforms that exist in any one tech stack. The way we try to think about this is we try to categorize these under 4 buckets. You need a set of platforms in your tech stack to establish your data foundation. You need a set of platforms to establish the content effectiveness layer. You need a set of platforms to establish activation capabilities. And you need a set of platforms to establish measurement capabilities, right? And when you think about it, like the regular suspects would come into the picture, which is you might need a data lake to store all your unstructured data. You might need a CDP to make sense of it, build that single 360 view of a customer and activate it across different destinations. You're going to need a CMS and a DAM to be able to actually build those websites, store those assets, manage the entire content lifecycle. The distribution layer can go on and on depending on the channels that you want to advertise in. You're gonna need a publisher side ad server to turn your own website into monetizing your inventory. You'll need a sponsored listings platform. You're going to need DSPs. You're going to need like ESPs. You're going to need different CTV platforms. You're going to need partnerships with paid social platforms. And at the end of it, for measurement, you're going to need a site analytics platform. You're going to need unified measurement as a capability. You'll need to be able to measure the brand impact and incremental lift on brand metrics. So a whole bunch of different platforms at the very least from an ad tech stack standpoint. And last but not the least, you're going to need third-party vendors to be able to measure the transparency, the brand safety, to monitor bot traffic, right? So again, like it's illustrative to the extent that these are the platforms you need. But I don't know, Andrew, anything else that you might want to add to the stack? Beef it up a little bit.
That sounds pretty comprehensive to me. Definitely your area of expertise more than mine, but that sounds like a pretty good stack.
Awesome. Well, we have time for one more question here. I mean, we have flown through our time. So let's end on a question about creative. Are there any best practices that you all can share on creative effectiveness in retail media and whether it varies by channel?
I could say that yes, it definitely varies by channel. That's true of any media. What works well in TV or streaming TV, 30-second storytelling, right? It's going to be very different. In that case, you've got copy testing and things that you can do for creative effectiveness. Display can be very different. There's dynamic creative optimization, so you can run through different iterations. One best practice that I will say in talking to some folks is on the digital shelf. So within the context of an e-commerce site, what many brands have sort of made the mistake of is using past copy for other types of ads, and it didn't work as well on the digital shelf. You've got often small thumbnail images. One of the things that works really well is high contrast. So really stark white background and a bright pop of color. Those sorts of elements actually are really necessary to work on the digital shelf. If you tried to do that same thing in the physical store, it probably just wouldn't work the same way. You probably want your brand color maybe to dominate more in the physical aisle. So there's a lot of different nuances. I think the reality of creative optimization is that there are so many complex variables, and often the impact comes from how the interplay of some of these variables. Very difficult. This is where AI and machine learning can come in and kind of help you figure out what those iterations are that are going to work best. But to say like broad brush, here are some best practices, there's not a whole lot that you can say definitively are going to work every time.
Yeah. For the longest time, I felt like brands and retailers have relied on platform metrics to assess the effectiveness of creative, right? Like this is one exciting space that we as Adobe are innovating, right? So we now offer content effectiveness analytics, the ability to measure the softer metrics around the tone, around the background, around the image. That is all layered with like the capabilities of Gen AI to create multiple variations and then determine precisely what is the impact of that creative on your marketing measurement, right? And it's a topic that I could go on and on, but I also realize we are very close to the webinar end time. Happy to share additional information on it as a follow-up.
Excellent. Well, you're right. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I'll say a quick round of thank yous. Thanks again to Andrew for joining us, and then a very special thanks to Shailesh and to the team at Adobe. Also, our Studio II crew, the eMarketer production team, deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. We quite literally couldn't do it without them. You can find a couple of free resources from Adobe in the resources tab below this video feed. And as promised, we'll be emailing you a link to today's slides, along with a full recording of the presentation. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. And then before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can sign up for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at emarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune into Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast, which you can find anywhere you listen to podcasts. And finally, please check out our newsletters. We have a number of options across digital marketing, banking, and we recently launched a new one all about retail media networks. So I have a feeling many of you would be interested in that, and there's something for everyone. So if you haven't already signed up, you can do so at emarketer.com/newsletters. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your workday.